So, what in the world does a hurricane have to do with your bank account? Well, it turns out a lot more than you'd probably guess. Today, we're going to dig into this really surprising, super high-stakes connection between a bank's bottom line and, some of the worst weather on Earth. And this is all based on some fascinating new research.
And look, this isn't just some environmentalist warning. This comes from Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England. The research we're diving into today uses this quote to make an absolutely crucial point. The world's top financial regulators see climate change not as some distant, fuzzy issue, but as a direct, right here, right now threat to financial stability. We're talking serious business.
And that really raises the perfect question, doesn't it? I mean, it seems so disconnected. You have a physical storm in one state, and somehow it's causing financial tremors in a corporate headquarters hundreds of miles away. But that's the exact puzzle we're going to piece together today. How does all that bad weather actually translate into real, measurable financial risk for the institutions we all count on? All right, so let's start by digging into the heart of the issue in our first section here, a bank's climate problem. This is where we'll start following the trail of risk.
The research makes it crystal clear. This is not a fringe issue anymore. Back in 2021, the U.S. Financial Stability Oversight Council, a pretty big deal, officially stated for the very first time that climate change is an emerging and growing threat to the entire U.S. financial system. So this isn't about some far-off what-if scenario. It's about protecting our economy right now from these huge, unpredictable shocks. But to really get a handle on this threat, regulators and researchers had to become part climatologist and part financial detective. They needed a map of the risk, and that meant they had to follow the money.
But how do you even begin to do that? I mean, just think about a massive national bank with thousands of branches all over the country. How on earth do you assign a single climate risk score to an institution that huge and spread out? That was the big, hairy challenge for the researchers behind this study.
And this is where their method gets really clever. It's basically a three-step process. Okay, so first, they mapped out the exact locations of thousands of bank branches and, this is key, how much money in deposits was held in each one. You got to remember, deposits are the lifeblood of a bank. Then, for step two, they laid a second map right on top of that first one, a map showing all the climate hotspots, so areas prone to floods, crazy heat, wildfires, and sea level rise. And finally, step three, they put it all together. They calculated a totally unique risk score for every single bank based on how much of its business, its share of deposits, was concentrated in those dangerous spots. So a bank with a ton of branches in coastal Louisiana would get a very different score than one mostly based in, say, Colorado.
Now, all this detailed mapping work led them to a really surprising connection. And it all revolves around those three letters we keep hearing about. ESG. That, of course, stands for environmental, social, and governance, which is basically just a way to measure a company's commitment to things beyond its raw profit.
So think about it for a second. If you're a bank and you suddenly discover that a bunch of your branches are sitting right in the crosshairs of future climate disasters, you'd be worried, right? The logical assumption is that you'd go into full-on defensive mode. But what does the data show these banks are actually doing about it?
Well, what the data shows is pretty much the complete opposite of what you might expect. As you can see right here, the banks with high climate risk exposure, they actually have significantly better ESG scores. They aren't just sitting around worrying, they're actively pouring money and effort into their environmental, social, and governance initiatives. And this wasn't some random fluke. The study found a clear, positive link. The more a bank is exposed to physical climate risk, the more it invests in beefing up its overall ESG performance. And this was true across the board, whether the risk was coming from floods, heat, or rising sea levels.
Okay, but while the data showed banks were taking these positive steps, it created this fascinating new puzzle, a huge disconnect between what the banks were doing and what the public was thinking. It's a classic case of perception versus performance.
And this slide just illustrates the paradox perfectly. On one side, like we just saw, higher climate risk leads to stronger ESG actions from the banks. But on the other side, the researchers found that higher climate risk was tied to weaker public sentiment toward those exact same banks. So people were getting more nervous even as the banks were doing more.
So what gives? Why the disconnect? Why wasn't the public, rewarding these banks for their ESG efforts? Was this all just empty PR from the banks? Or was there something deeper going on that the public was sensing?
And that brings us to our final section, where we connect all the dots and finally reveal the solution to this puzzle. It's really the key finding of the entire research, and we're calling it the billion-dollar shield.
So it turns out the public's gut feeling was spot on. The researchers confirmed that, all else being equal, being exposed to greater climate risk has a real negative impact on a bank's core financial performance, specifically its return on assets. The threat isn't just theoretical, it's actually hitting their bottom line.
Okay, so this table right here, this is the whole enchilada. This is the key to the entire story. For banks with weak or just kind of average ESG performance, you can see that climate risk has a negative or even a significantly negative impact on their financials. The public's fears are totally justified. But then, look at that bottom row. For the banks with strong ESG performance, climate risk has, get this, no significant impact. It's like the negative financial effect just vanishes.
This is what the researchers call the financial shield. Strong ESG performance isn't just about good publicity or looking green. It seems to act as a tangible, real-world buffer, insulating a bank's profits from the actual financial damage caused by these climate-related events.
A really great way to picture this is to think of good ESG as a financial seawall. Investing in all these initiatives doesn't stop the hurricane from making landfall, of course not, but it seems to build a kind of resilience inside the bank that protects its financial foundations from the worst of the storm surge. The banks facing high risk, they aren't just investing in ESG to look good. They're doing it because it's a sound financial strategy to fight back against a very real threat.
And that leaves us with a pretty powerful thought to chew on. As these billion-dollar weather disasters become more and more common, we really have to ask, is a bank's ESG score becoming just as critical to its survival as its traditional balance sheet? Based on this evidence, the answer seems to be a resounding yes.